Hi, my name is Moises Rodriguez, and I'm here to talk to you about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is part of an overall approach to macroeconomic policy, which takes the the aspect of what we call gauges and switches. By that I mean that we're trying to see in which direction the overall economy is going. Is it going in the right direction or not? Do we have an Exxon Valdez about to happen, or is everything just peachy? We use our gauges of GDP, unemployment, and inflation to tell us that. From there, we use our switches, which is monetary policy and fiscal policy, to alter the direction of the economy. Now, historically, fiscal policy has only been used for long-term structural issues. In turn, monetary policy has been used for short-term fluctuations. Now, when we talk about fluctuations, we can talk about ebbs and flows of the economy, peaks and valleys, or we can also include major growth and expansion modes, as well as recessions and depressions. Now, what we've seen is that we've had obviously a major recession since 2007, 2008. Prior to that, fiscal policy or a major reform bill for fiscal policy had not been used since 1986. We're going to discuss why fiscal policy was necessary as part of the stimulus package in 2008 and 2009. Now, typically in a macroeconomics course, monetary policy is discussed first. So I'm going to have to make certain reference to certain concepts of to monetary policy as we discuss fiscal policy in this particular case. What does fiscal policy involve? Well, fiscal policy involves government spending and taxes. So that really can involve four individual strategic moves: an increase in government spending, a decrease in government spending, an increase in taxes, or a decrease in taxes. When the government is looking to stimulate the economy, we use what's called expansionary policy. Okay? Expansionary policy involves increasing government spending or decreasing taxes or some combination of both. When the government sees that the economy is growing too fast, and when we talked about GDP, inflation, and unemployment, we talked about an economy getting too hot or growing too fast. That typically leads to inflation, an inflation beyond a level that we consider desirable. And therefore, we, under a fiscal policy mode, would implement what we call contractionary policy. And that involves a decrease in government spending or an increase in tax or a combination of both. Now, each has a particular effect, as we're going to be discussing. Again, expansionary policy has been used typically to foment investment through the decrease in taxes. The last significant major reform bill, as I mentioned, was 1986, when Ronald Reagan implemented the 1986 Tax Reform Act. And historically, that has been shown to have a great deal of success. We went through a period of very high growth in the late 80s and 90s. And the decrease in taxes that Ronald Reagan was able to get approved through Congress is based on a concept called trickle-down economics. What is trickle-down economics? Trickle-down economics basically follows the concept that if you put money into somebody's hands, they're going to go out and spend more, and that creates an effect that everybody else follows. It's sort of like a domino effect that the person that gets additional money will spend it, and they'll spend it on some consumer related item or some business related item, and then the person that that consumer buys from will then in turn spend it. And so therefore it creates an expansionary effect. Now, contractionary policy, on the other hand, has the opposite effect. Contractionary policy has been typically used when we have demand pull inflation. Now, when we talked about inflation, we said that there's two types of inflation: demand pull and cost push. Demand pull is when we have excessive demand related to the supply. We can infer that there's a scarcity issue and that people want a particular item and they're willing to pay a higher price for that item. And therefore, the overall effect is inflation, and many times when we have a demand pull inflation, our concern is that the inflation rate is going to get higher than what we're comfortable with. Now, one of the ways that we can implement contractionary policy is through an increase in taxes. And under this concept, what that brings about is that we increase the taxes, we leave less money in the consumer's hand, and in turn, they have less after-tax income to go spend, with the desired effect of lowering consumer demand. Now, one of the issues that we're going to be talking about later on in this discussion is capital flight. And that's based on the concept that if you continue to increase taxes, people will take their money elsewhere. And we'll talk about that more later on in this video. Currently, we have a potential capital flight issue with the cliff taxes. As most of you are probably aware of, this came about when George W. Bush decreased the tax bracket for the wealthy on a temporary basis, and Obama extended that provision, and it's now about to expire. Now, let me talk briefly about the system of taxation. Taxes can either be progressive, proportional, or regressive. An example of progressive taxes would be our income taxes. As we all know, the more income that you earn, the higher tax bracket eventually that you'll have to pay tax on. And so on down the line, the lower income that you reflect, the lower tax bracket that you're in. Now, the advantage of this system is that it does, while it may create a disincentive, okay, from the standpoint that it puts people in a higher tax bracket, there's also an equity concept behind this, because when you earn more money, you have more disposable income. What do I mean by that? You have certain basic necessities that you need a certain degree of income to meet. Once you start exceeding a current level of income, then you really have this disposable income that can go to discretionary spending other than your bare necessities. Of course, bare necessities can really vary up according to one's definition. Still yet, being subject to a higher tax bracket is not as painful when you have an income level that already covers your bare necessities and you have certain discretionary spending. Now, let's talk about regressive taxes on the other hand. Those can be very painful and actually provide more of a disincentive because they actually hit the people that have the lesser ability to pay. You see, the progressive tax system is based on the concept of ability to pay. As I mentioned before, the progressive system taxes more of the people in the higher income bracket because they have more of this discretionary income and therefore they have a greater ability to pay. And on the regressive tax system, let's talk about a few examples. Sales tax is a very good example of a regressive tax. Why? Because sales tax applies to a lot of our bare necessities. One of the few items that's exempt from sales tax is food, but a lot of our other basic necessities is subject to sales tax, and therefore we have to pay tax on a lot of our bare essentials. Why does this turn out to be a regressive tax? Because if we look at it, people in a lower income bracket have to use a higher percentage of their overall income on bare necessities. Therefore, a greater percentage of their income is going to be subject to tax than someone in a higher tax bracket that has discretionary income that they can actually use for investments. And investments are not subject to sales tax. So therefore, and at the end of the result, what you have is lower income people paying a higher percentage of sales tax on their overall income than people in a higher tax bracket that are only paying sales tax on their bare essentials. Hopefully that makes sense. The other thing that is regressive is a value-added tax that we're going to talk about more at the end of this video. And the reason why a value-added tax is also regressive is based on the same concept as the sales tax, simply because a value-added tax is much like a sales tax. And in Europe and Mexico, in many Latin American countries, people are subject to a value-added tax, and when they go to the grocery store, to the liquor store, or wherever, they have to consider that what they're about to buy is going to be subject to a value-added tax. Now, let's talk about why fiscal policy had to be used in 2008 and 2009. And that's simply because monetary policy was deemed ineffective during our Great Recession. If some of you may recall, the discount rate, and the discount rate is the interest rate that's charged to other banks to borrow from the Fed, was lowered 4 times, all within 1 year, with minimal effect on stimulating the economy. So in effect, the federal government was drawing blanks in all their attempts to stimulate the economy. The interest rate was near zero, and yet we were not getting the results that we needed. So therefore, President Obama resorted to fiscal policy. Now, in this particular case, the fiscal policy that was implemented was, in effect, a decrease in taxes. Actually, the tax refunds, the rebates, the refunds that were all handed down to individuals were a form of negative income tax credits, you might say. That was designed to put money in people's hands, much like the concept of trickle-down economics. Unfortunately, what happened is that this money, 80 to 90% of this money, was used to pay down debt instead of going out and spending more. As a result, this fiscal policy was relatively ineffective. And to this date, the federal government has found very little tools, if any, that has been effective in being able to stimulate the economy. And that's why our slow growth has extended for such a long time. Now, let's talk about some other issues about fiscal policy. I had mentioned capital flight. In the tax world, and quite honestly, my profession has been tax law, aside from the fact that I do work in the economic field, especially having to do with hedging and so forth. The concept of tax flight is that you cannot tax wealth. We can think about all the examples of that going back to Rod Stewart in the 70s when Britain had a 70% tax rate. What did people like Rod Stewart and others do? They left the country. People are willing to just give up their citizenship for the country that they were born and raised in to seek a lower tax rate. We've seen this recently in the partner of Mark Zuckerberg for Facebook, that he actually went to live in one of the islands, I forget, Bermudas or whatever, the Caribbean islands. These places are considered tax havens, and along with other tax strategies, they're designed to avoid having to pay taxes in the United States. So in general, when you go too far in the concept that I'm going to tax the rich, that is simply a fallacy, because you will not be able to tax wealth. And historically, it has been found that the most successful strategy is that you provide an incentive-based system to foment investment. In turn, these investors invest in the area that the incentives exist, and that investment winds up creating jobs, and as an end result, winds up providing an expansionary result to the economy, stimulating growth. One of the other issues involved in fiscal policy is what we call the crowding out effect. Now, what is the crowding out effect? Well, essentially, when we have expansionary policy, government spending is increased, or at least that's one of the ways that we can have expansionary policy. And one of the results can be that when the government starts spending more directly, there's less funding to state and local governments. And a lot of you may know that state and local governments around the country depend greatly on federal funding. So when it's redirected directly to spending by the federal government, there's less money to go around for the local and state governments. One of the other effects can be that this increased government spending replaces consumer spending. So therefore, you have a net effect that does not result in expansionary policy or stimulating growth. One of the other things that's related to what we've been talking about is that when you have an increase in taxes, you could discourage investment. And investors will look to put their money elsewhere. As we know, we live in a global economy. That investment can be placed in other countries, in other vehicles of investment that are simply not subject to tax. And as a result, it's not properly directed in a way to stimulate growth in the economy the way that we would like. Now, let me focus a little bit more on some of the theory behind expansionary policy. Because expansionary policy typically leads to deficits. We are currently following, under the Obama administration, what we call Keynesian economics. This was really brought about by a very famous economist, John Maynard Keynes. And his thought was that when the economy is in a downturn and you need something to stimulate the economy, you can run deficits in the short run to get the economy going back to a level that's acceptable. The problem is that when you start using this kind of expansionary policy on a long-term basis, there are concerns about structural issues that may arise, by allowing these deficits to accumulate beyond what we might call a safe level. Right now, we are in the midst of accumulating $16 trillion of deficits. And the concern is that we will very soon be compared to Japan in the 80s, where they accumulated so many deficits that then it's very hard to stimulate growth. So it becomes a catch-22 that when you start accumulating so many deficits, it's going to be hard to dig your way out, because one of the few ways to dig your way out of this deficit is through increased taxes. And historically, that has been known to stymie growth instead of stimulate growth. And we talk about the capital flight issue where you cannot tax wealth. And we've also, I guess, been discussing lately the concern, especially with the Tea Party, that you have to be careful about how much you increase taxes, because now people can start revolting, and we certainly don't want to wind up in a situation like Greece. And the main issue with Greece is that people don't believe in paying taxes because they don't see the benefit. Mexico has had a situation like that to a great extent. And so one of the things that distinguishes the United States from other countries is that we're able to increase taxes, and people go along with that. They're supportive so that we can dig our way out. But the issue is that if we allow these deficits to continue to accumulate, then the general population may not go along with the kind of taxes that are going to be needed to dig our way out of this deficit. Another issue associated with expansionary policy, or just taxing the wealth, is this concept of income redistribution. And essentially, this is sort of like a Robin Hood approach, that you take away from the rich and give to the poor. Well, having talked about this capital flight issue, I think you can probably see that this is not very likely to work, because the people with wealth are simply going to look at this as a major disincentive and take their money elsewhere. And so I don't think that that's going to be a very popular or successful venture. Let me drift on to talking about incentives or disincentives to entrepreneurs. As we have to increase our tax rates, then I personally think that that's going to be a disincentive not only for investors but entrepreneurs. If we take, for example, Europe, we've seen that this type of system has not really worked to foment entrepreneurialism, which is probably the most valuable trait that we have in the US compared to other major economies in this world. Now let me talk a little bit about the Social Security system. We all know that with these deficits, we have been eating into the Social Security funds, and there's a concern of whether our future generations are actually going to be able to benefit from Social Security or whether Social Security will be bankrupt by then. Now, one of the things that we're already looking at is increasing the age for retirement. We've already toyed with the idea of going to 67 and 70. We're also looking at increasing the percentage of Social Security benefits that are subject to tax. Currently, there's an income threshold that you must surpass before your Social Security benefits are subject to tax. But once you surpass that threshold, 85% of your Social Security benefits are actually subject to income tax, which is certainly a disincentive. There's other issues. We're looking at the funds for Medicare and Medicaid running out much quicker than Social Security. And so in a very short term, we may be looking at decreased benefits just to keep the fund functioning. The other thing that we're looking at is disability. In recent years, there's been a great amount of increase of people applying for disability. Currently, that fund is expected to dry up within 5 years. Then we move on to private retirement plans. Okay, there is going to be a much greater need for people to set up their private retirement plans as a substitute to the existing Social Security system. Other things that we will have to consider, given the situation of our economy and the trend that it's going, is we need to upgrade the skills of immigration workers. Truthfully, our current unemployment situation is more related to the existing skills of our general population and more so the middle level jobs. And this really addresses the structural unemployment issue that has resulted by us not only losing the manufacturing sector to other countries, but the very fact that through automation, robotics, and technological innovation, a lot of our workers no longer have the skill level to fill the jobs that are needed. Let me conclude by talking about value-added taxes. If we continue the deficit trend that we're going, it is very likely to lead to a situation that we are going to need to implement what we call a value-added tax or a flat tax. We've already talked about that this is a regressive type tax that creates a great disincentive. And the other thing is that it creates a disincentive to spend. So therefore, it's a catch-22 because we're going to need additional taxes to dig our way out of this accumulating deficit. But then these tools to get us out are going to create a disincentive for spending. Therefore, it's going to be very difficult for us to increase demand, to have expansionary policy, and therefore stimulate growth and have a vibrant economy. I want to conclude by an example of people that I know in the Netherlands. As you know, people in Europe have to deal with a very high tax rate. And I know a particular friend that is a professional, and with their VAT system, okay, and the cost of their gas, they have to really think about whether they're going to use their vehicle to get to and from work or wherever they're going. Quite honestly, in the wintertime, you'll see women carrying babies in a bicycle, and the only time that they really will use their vehicle is when the wind is blowing from the North Sea and that cold wind is just unbearable. But otherwise, they're able to transport their babies and themselves in 20 below weather. Also, if you're coming home from work and you're thinking about buying a bottle of wine, and for us, it would be so easy at stopping like at Spitzer's or Costco Wine and buying a pretty good bottle of wine for under $10. They have to consider a VAT of 15 to 18%. And that alone could create a disincentive to even consider buying that bottle of wine to have dinner with your wife. I hope this video has been informative to you regarding fiscal policy. Thank you.